Hello everybody, Torello here, and welcome to this next episode of my series looking at interwar tanks that I think should be added to War Thunder. And today we will be taking a look at the Chinese tanks of the interwar period. So just a quick recap of China's situation after World War I. As mentioned last time we looked at China, it had missed out on the initial development of the tank as they hadn't taken part in the fighting on the Western Front. While a descent into warlordism in the early 1920s resulted in the first Chinese tanks being French FT tanks imported by the warlord Jiang Zuoling of the Fentian army. But on the bright side, by the end of the 1920s, the Kuomintang or KMT under Chiang Kai-shek had reunified China, with Jiang Zuoling being assassinated by the Japanese and his son Jiang Zuiliang taking command of the Fentian army and allying with the KMT. So things were starting to look a little bit up for China. Unfortunately, at this point the Chinese Civil War kicked off as the KMT and Chinese Communist Party or CCP started fighting each other. The Japanese Kwantung Army invaded Manchuria and set up the Manchukuo puppet government, which actually resulted in Chiang Kai-shek being kidnapped by his own generals and forced to sign a truce with the CCP in 1936, so everyone could focus on the Japanese. And finally, in 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War kicked off, so China suddenly had a great need for modern tanks, which it acquired from numerous nations including Britain, Germany and the Soviet Union, as China didn't make any tanks domestically in this period. So we'll start off with the British tanks, with China buying over 60 British tanks from 1930 to 1936, these being the Vickers-Carden-Lloyd Mark VI, the Vickers-Carden-Lloyd light amphibious tanks, and 20 of the Vickers Marquis Type B, aka the Vickers 6-ton. Unfortunately, the Carden-Lloyd Mark VI and the amphibious tanks, while interesting, were only armed with light caliber machine guns, so would not be suitable for adding in-game, even at the lowest battle ratings. But the Vickers 6-ton would be a very good tank for the Chinese tech tree, as it is armed with a 47mm gun. Unfortunately, it's a short barrel 47mm gun, so the muzzle velocity is quite low at 433 meters a second, giving a maximum armour penetration of around 25mm at 500 meters, which is better than the FT tank's 37mm gun, but it still might struggle against more armoured enemies. Meanwhile, its own armour maxes out at around 15mm or so, and its top speed is 20 miles per hour or 31 kilometers an hour, while a crew of 3 mans the tank. Overall, I think this could be added at around 0.7, as this is a much better tank than the previous French FT tank, having a better gun, armour protection, mobility and higher crew count. But it will struggle against more modern tanks that will have the armour to withstand its 47mm gun, while being able to fire straight through the Marquis' own armour with little trouble. In real life, the Vickers Marquis tanks, as well as the amphibious tanks, would be deployed in the Battle of Shanghai in 1937, and they were for the most part quickly destroyed or captured by the Japanese during the intense urban combat, with at least one of these being returned to Japan as part of a display of tanks captured in China. So with the most effective British tanks being taken out of the picture early on, the KMT started to look in towards the Soviet Union, who had large quantities of tanks and other armoured vehicles available. Now, you might think it's a bit odd for the Soviets to supply the KMT with tanks over the Chinese Communist Party, but as the KMT made up the central government, had the larger and more effective army and, in theory, more territory under its control, it made sense to send tanks to them, at least until the end of the war against Japan. The tanks the Soviets sent were 83 T-26s, which were already in the Chinese tech tree, but a smaller number of BT-5s were also sent, which could also be added at 1.0, giving Chinese players a highly mobile and dangerous tank to use alongside the T-26. It does seem that some armoured cars were sent as well, but information on these is sparser, with various sources naming the 45mm armed BA-6 and 37mm armed BA-27 as those sent, though other sources seem to suggest otherwise, and other sources just don't mention them at all, so like I say, sources are a little bit sparse on these. But if added, the BA-27 would only work at 0.3 to 0.7, due to being armed with a short 37mm Hotchkiss gun, while the BA-6 with the much more formidable 45mm gun would work well at 1.0 to 1.3. giving Chinese players more choices in effective armoured cars for use in the lower tiers. In real life, the Chinese 200th Division received most of the Soviet tanks, and some of the T-26s managed to survive all the way until the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, so it seems they did far better than the British tanks, though they were never around in large enough numbers to make a decisive impact on the war. Aside from the British and Soviet tanks, which represent the most effective tanks available to the Chinese tech tree, there were also tanks brought from France, Germany and Italy. Looking at France first, we have the Renault ZB, which was a variant of the French AMR 33 light tank that had been lengthened and fitted with a new suspension, although France never accepted it for service. But 12 would be ordered by the KMT in March 1936, with 6 to be armed with the 37mm SA-18 and 6 with 13.2mm Hotchkiss machine guns, while a few months later the Yunnan provincial government would order a further 4 with 13.2mm machine guns. As you might already know, the 37mm SA-18 was not a particularly effective anti-tank weapon, and it has an in-game penetration of just 33mm at 100 metres, but this is with an APCR round that the Chinese wouldn't have had access to, while the 13.2mm machine gun would have a penetration of 25mm at 100 metres. In theory being less effective in pure penetration power, at least compared to the APCR round, but having the advantage of being a machine gun, so able to overwhelm targets with a high rate of fire. Unfortunately, the armour is light, maxing out at just 13mm, while the top speed is about 37 miles per hour or 60 kilometers an hour, and a 2-man crew operates the vehicle, making this a very fast but vulnerable vehicle for the Chinese tech tree. I could see this being added at 0.3 for the 37mm variant or 0.7 for the 13.2mm variant, as both of these variants would be very fast but vulnerable, but well suited to flanking attacks, especially with the machine gun variant, and they would make for very effective scouting vehicles. Moving on to the German tank, we have the Panzer I Ausf A, with China buying 15 of these in 1936. Like with the Soviets, it might seem odd for Germany to sell China these tanks, considering they were allied with Japan in World War II, but before 1937, Sino-German relations were pretty good, with China buying much German equipment, German officers helping to train and modernise the nationalist army, and Germany didn't recognise the puppet state of Manchukuo that Japan had created after occupying Manchuria. So when China was looking for tanks, it seemed a good bet to buy some of the new German Panzer Is. Unfortunately, this tank was armed only with 2 7.92mm MG13 machine guns, which in theory should make this all but useless against tanks, but during the Spanish Civil War, Panzer Is could defeat T-26s at 150 metres with AP rounds, so it could potentially just about work in War Thunder, at least at the very lowest tiers. It should be noted that some of the Panzers had their armament replaced by Soviet machine guns, but I suspect they also wouldn't be very effective against tanks. Armour, as to be expected, is light at only 13mm, the top speed is 23 miles per hour or 37 kilometers an hour, and it has a 2-man crew, again making this a very vulnerable tank. In-game, I suspect it would have to be a 0.0, maybe 0.3 tanker to push, relying on getting extremely close to enemy flanks and knocking them out with its quick-firing machine guns before the enemy can return fire, as any incoming fire will be all but certain to knock out the Panzer I in short order. In real life, despite the tanks being ordered in 1936, they didn't arrive until June 1937, just a month before the war started, and due to being improperly shipped, they were heavily affected by the weather en route, with water collecting at the bottom of the tanks, rust being prevalent, lots of oxidation being present, as well as numerous other problems. Ultimately, all of the Panzer Is were lost during the Battle of Nanjing in December 1937, with some of these being captured by Japanese troops and sent back to Japan for testing and display purposes, though they were labelled as Soviet tanks for political reasons. But these were some of the only panzers to ever make it to Japan, which is a pretty cool footnote. It should also be noted that SDKFZ 221 and 222 armoured cars were also sent to China, but the latter is already in the Chinese tech tree and the former was only armed with machine guns, so it shouldn't be added. Ultimately, a change in German policy towards China would result in the ending of arms supplies to that country, the withdrawal of German officers, and the recognition of Manchukuo, ending the possibility of more German tanks being sent to China, with the USSR providing the bulk of future tanks. Lastly, we have the Italian CV-35 Tankette, with a number of these being sent to China, but unfortunately I doubt this Tankette could be added as it only has two 8mm machine guns, so unless very effective AP bullets could be used with it, I doubt it would have any success, even at 0.0, while its two-man crew and maximum armour of 14mm would make it very easy prey for enemies, though its top speed of 26 miles per hour will allow it to move around at a decent speed at the very least. So that is all of the nations that China acquired tanks from, at least legitimately, because there is of course one more nation we need to cover, which is the Japanese. Of course, the Second Sino-Japanese War lasted from 1937 till 1945 when Japan surrendered, and so China naturally did manage to capture quite a few of their tanks. Now most of these are already in the Chinese tech tree, but there are a few that could still be added. For example, the Type 95 Hargo, which is already in War Thunder, as well as the Type 97 Tiki, a tankette armed with a 37mm gun, and the Type 92 Tankette, which is armed with a hull-mounted 13mm gun. So both of these tanks could be added to the Chinese tech tree, but I think these should only really be added if they are needed to fill a gap. So ultimately, while China had made a good effort at trying to upgrade its army with more modern tanks, most of these were just lost in the early days of the war, and while the Soviet tanks did make a bit of a difference, they were never around in large enough numbers to make a decisive impact on the war, especially when compared to the Japanese, who also had very modern tanks and had them around in much larger numbers. So that's it for this episode looking at Chinese interwar tanks I'd like to see added to War Thunder, and I'd be interested to hear your views on these tanks in the comments below. So now that we've finished all of the main nations of War Thunder, I think I'll probably move on to covering the Czechoslovakian or Spanish tanks for the next episode, and I would then likely move on to World War II tanks after that. So hopefully you'll join me for those episodes. But anyway, I've been Terreno, hopefully you've enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you next time.